Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Sports Speak. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And my name's Tim Moore.
We got a fun show for you today, and we're going to start things off with our Belmont Stakes picks. Of course, we had Kyle Schultz on Monday, so we didn't really get into this. But, Tim, your horse actually came in second place. You were counting out the favorite, Tis the Law, though, and he still got it from that 8th post. But Dr. Post coming home second. My horse didn't do as well, Tap It to Win, but you almost got it there.
I did almost get it. But, you talk about Tis the Law, first off, obviously the odds-on favorite. I mean, essentially, history was made with Tis the Law winning. I do want to first off reference, before I talk about my horse coming in second, was that this is, I believe, the 6th time in history, particularly from post 8, a horse has won the Belmont Stakes. So you look at that, that's pretty against the odds. The only reason why I say that is because the all-time post winner is actually coming straight out of post 1, in which post 1's won 21 times in the Belmont Stakes long history. But another stat that I actually just came up with, Eddie, that was pretty interesting. This is actually the first horse since 1982 to win a Belmont Stakes.
Wow, that's very interesting. I mean, I got to ask you, because Tis the Law, I mean, he came in as the odds-on favorite easily. Coming from that 8th post, we didn't really know, but he still got the Belmont Stakes. Do you think he's got a chance to win the Kentucky Derby and contend for that Triple Crown come the Preakness?
Now, if I'm not mistaken, the Kentucky Derby is September, right? First week of
Yes.
September.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think there's a very good chance. We talked about a few weeks ago, or really a week ago, when the Belmont was first about to happen, about how these horses had a lot of rest. For Tis the Law, there's going to be a constant training schedule, but he's not planned for any races in between, because typically the Belmont would be what's capping everything off, So I'm eager to see, with a little bit of rest and not too much wear, how Tis the Law does come September, and then it'll be the Preakness that ends it all off. But we saw an interesting race. Remember, Eddie, how we talked about how with the rest, we didn't know what we were going to expect.
Mm-hmm.
We saw a really, really good race, even though obviously he was projected to win, ended up winning. But the results were pretty much right down the middle in regards of who was going to be a front runner. I think you're going to see the same standard held. I still think Tis the Law can win, because he's proven that he is a far faster and stronger horse, especially in the longer races, compared to others. So I'm eager to see, with this little rest period, how he does in September. But I'm going to say this, Eddie. I know I said last week where, we've been granted with a bunch of Triple Crowns recently. It's probably going to go on a dry spell, but after seeing the Belmont Stakes, I don't really think that's going to be the case this year. I think Tis the Law has not just a really good chance of a Triple Crown, but, dominating the next 2 races.
Yeah, I think he's got a really good shot as well. And of course, September is the Kentucky Derby. October is the Preakness. It's a little switched up in order this year. So second order of business today, we've got to talk NASCAR because, of course, the storylines have been big these last 72 hours or so, going all the way back to Sunday night. So Sunday, the race was supposed to happen at Talladega. It got rained out, but that was not the story. As around 11 o'clock that night, reports came that a noose had been found in Bubba Wallace's garage. And we saw an incredible showing of solidarity from all the drivers and crews pre-race when they all went up with Bubba Wallace. Richard Petty, who is part of that very high-risk category when it comes to coronavirus, 82 years old, has had health problems in the past. He's the owner of Bubba Wallace's car, and even he came to the track for the first time since the pandemic started to support his driver. It was a really nice showing. We had a great race, obviously. Wild finish. Ryan Blaney won. But then in recent days, things have really, I don't know, it's gotten tenuous amongst fans and amongst fans of NASCAR and NASCAR itself, as it was discovered that the noose was actually a garage pole that recently it's been discovered was there since the fall when Penske had that same garage stall that Bubba Wallace had, and they had tied it in such a way. Obviously, there was actually very recently, just within the hour, NASCAR confirmed the photo of the garage pole that looked like a noose, and it certainly, I mean, for someone who doesn't know about garage poles or anything, I'd think that was a noose if I first saw it because it looked exactly like it. And honestly, I think it was a mistake just on the crew member's part. I don't think there's anything, because people are comparing this to the infamous Jussie Smollett incident. I think these are two completely different stories. Bubba Wallace never actually saw this thing personally. I don't think this is something that was just fabricated by NASCAR to fit in with the movement at the time. I got to ask you, what do you make of everything that's gone on recently?
Well, first off, before we address the Bubba Wallace situation, I did want to say you mentioned Richard Petty. Did you see how he looks with a mask on? He looks like an outlaw. It's pretty.
The
It's
cowboy hat
pretty awesome.
and
Oh yeah. I like. You always think about Richard Petty as well with like Jack Roush always be known for the hat on. But I like that mask. That's pretty awesome. But
Mhm.
the Bubba Wallace situation, and Bubba kind of talked about it a little bit more yesterday. It was one of his crew members that brought it up. Now, I am going to say this. Some NASCAR fans are going to be critical. There was a lot of stories going on at Talladega today, or I shouldn't say today, but this past weekend. You had fans flying airplanes asking to defund NASCAR with the Confederate flag, attached to an airplane and such. That doesn't help the situation. There's no place right now in terms of Talladega and NASCAR for racism. And NASCAR is doing a great step in a proper direction. Now, in regarding to the Bubba Wallace situation, yes, unfortunately, it wasn't how do I put it? It wasn't a directed situation, thankfully, towards Bubba Wallace. But I'm glad to an extent that this was brought up. And everyone can say, oh, Bubba Wallace set this up. He knew. No, it was his crew member that saw this. And his crew member went up and down the garages, okay? And he talked to multiple people before confronting NASCAR. And what basically happened is that, it does look like a noose. Now, what very could have happened, and I actually found a picture, Eddie, not just of last year, in which you referred to the Ryan Blaney,
Mhm.
or maybe it's Paul Menard, but it was Ryan Blaney's garage number 4 that was tied that way. I also found a picture as well when the trucks raced there with John Hunter Nemechek.
Yes, I saw that.
So that could have been even longer than 2019. So the way I look at it is this, though, is that it very well could have been a crew member, not even trying to tie it in that direction, but rather, trying to make it handle to make it easier to pull down the garage. But at the same time, you can't deny the fact that it looks like a noose. So I don't blame, first off, Bubba Wallace for being offended. I don't blame the crews for being offended. The fans that are taking this to an extreme level need to really take a big look at themselves and evaluation, because at the end of the day, NASCAR was trying to do the best to protect not just its driver, but also its integrity as well. And regardless of if it was wrong or what fans use a quote-unquote publicity stunt, which it isn't, this shows how far the sport has gone. And, I support NASCAR. I support Bubba Wallace. And quite frankly, it's a quite ignorant statement, in my opinion, to say that something like this was set up, because it was NASCAR trying to protect its driver and make sure justice was served if this was done intentional.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. And I want to just talk about big picture here as well, because I feel like NASCAR, because there's so many people that are critical. Why was NASCAR, did everybody jump the gun so much that this was automatically a noose? But you think about the circumstances too. Just, you mentioned the planes flying over, everything with the Confederate flags, the defund NASCAR. They knew there was a lot of people who were against them from these past couple of weeks. And you knew also, it's kind of gotten lost in the shuffle over the past couple of weeks, but NASCAR basically had to get rid of one of their top drivers for saying a racial slur. I mean, they've had issues very recently, and that still hasn't faded out of their minds. So they know that within the industry, and everything with Ray Ciccarelli as well, I mean, within the industry, there's people who do not necessarily agree with the direction NASCAR's going. But personally, I don't think this is that bad. I mean, it's progress that's being made. It's changes that are being made. And honestly, it's not having any effect on the racing product. The people who are that upset about this, really, they don't care about the actual cars going around the track. They care that NASCAR has the same political agenda as them. And honestly, I don't really see this as much of a political agenda per se. They're just, I don't know, they're working with what the times give them. And think about something else too. people that are like opposed that NASCAR did this. If there was any other sport out there, think about any of the four major sports. I mean, obviously it wouldn't be a garage pole, but if something was shaped like a noose, any other sport you would have seen an investigation too. It's not just something that NASCAR did because they're trying to be woke or fit with the times or whatever, or just support Bubba Wallace. I think people just have to recognize that NASCAR is trying to embrace the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that's going on in these recent weeks ever since the George Floyd murder, and understand that. And I also want to just bring in one more thing. NASCAR is not, because there's people who are like, NASCAR's gotten socialist and all these crazy things on the internet. I mean, they still care very much about the military. They still care very much. We've still got the invocation before the race. The national anthem is still very important. And just don't forget, the president was there for the first race of the year this year, and that was less than 6 months ago. This isn't like some crazy, drastic, wholesale change. They're just trying to root out some of the root problems that they've had, and much of that has been racism. When you think about in the past that there have been very few drivers of color in the past, they're not just trying to, they're not just trying to simply just rig it for Bubba Wallace or something. They're trying to support him, and they saw this possibly as a threat. Like you said, it looked like a noose that was there, and I think NASCAR is heading in the right direction, and I don't think they deserve any of the blame, and certainly Bubba Wallace does not deserve any blame for this.
Did you see by chance also the article about Sonoma, how they just found a noose on their property? So I'm eager to see how this goes as well, because now you're starting to see NASCAR tracks that, people may not be at, and you're going to have also, track owners, even though the Talladega case wasn't intentful, you're going to start having track owners start looking out for things like this now.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think this is really setting the precedent that NASCAR, and you've seen some of the changes, not just the Confederate flag thing. I saw last week on their Twitter that they hired like some vice president of like ensuring like diversity within the sport. You've seen the drive for diversity within the last few years has really become prevalent. Of course, you had a foreign-born champion of the Xfinity Series in Daniel Suarez a few years ago. NASCAR is progressing, I think, in the right direction to make some changes, to not just be the stereotypical good old Southern white boy sport. I mean, I think they're making some very nice changes, and we're seeing really much. I know there's people that are opposed to it, but the vast majority of NASCAR fans are embracing these changes, and we're seeing new fans coming in as well. So just to wrap up on the Bubba Wallace thing, I want to ask you, in the long run, do you think this is going to help the sport?
Oh, I think 100% this is going to help the sport. Don't get me wrong. While, yes, again, and I keep on mentioning, while it may have not been an intentful noose, at the end of the day, NASCAR was doing a good thing. And they cared about not just its drivers, but also its crew members, because we can't fail to, to neglect the fact that there are African Americans that also participate in these crews for these NASCAR teams. So if anything, they're more of a majority than the NASCAR drivers. And I think it's important that NASCAR protected them as well. So, there's that factor. And then you also mentioned Donald Trump coming for the Daytona 500. That's a big thing as well, because in terms of uniting as one, I think that was the beginning. And you look at it all, NASCAR slowly starting to make its ties, trying to go through racial barriers and show, hey, this is more than what its past is. It's about, uniting, racing together, but bringing everyone back home, either to watch a race or at the racetrack. And obviously right now, Talladega was a race that did have fans, by the way, but it wasn't. It's about uniting everyone together, rather on Sundays, Saturdays, whenever there's a race. And I applaud NASCAR 100%. I think they're going in the right direction. But Eddie, I do want to ask you now, going in, transitioning over to the race, how did you feel about Talladega this week? Because I'll tell you what, that may have been the best racing. I hope they keep this aero package I've seen at Talladega and a super speedway for, in fact, in a very long time.
Yeah, I just want to say about this aero package. It is not very good at short tracks. It's iffy at road courses. Depends on the mile and a half. But it's really, really good at Daytona and Talladega, and that proved it on Monday when they ended up going racing. That first stage before the rain delay, those 58 laps, There was never more than 4 cars single file in front of the field. It was 2 and 3 wide. So many lead changes, most lead changes in a Talladega race since the 2-car tandem era back in 2011. And we know how many wild lead changes there were back in that race, that classic 4 wide finish with Jimmy Johnson and Clint Boyer. I mean, this is really exciting racing that we saw from beginning to end, and I think there was a little bit of everything to make NASCAR fans really excited. We had a great finish to stage 2 with Ricky Stenhouse Jr. getting it done in almost a photo finish. We did get a couple of wrecks. You know, there are going to be the NASCAR fans who want to be there for the big one, and we did see a couple of big wrecks. Of course, the thing at the final lap, Chase Elliott had a big crash, but lastly, a really exciting finish. Kevin Harvick and Chris Buescher are in front going into turn 3. They weren't even a factor in the final finish. And how about Eric Almirola going across the line backwards, going a little Formula drift across the line, 3rd place. Of course, there were some people who weren't particularly happy with Ryan Blaney's move on Eric Jones and John Hunter Nemechek. And I wonder, had he not put the little bit of the side swipe on Jones, how quickly the 20 and the 38 could have gotten alongside of him, and could we have had a potential 4 wide photo finish? But I don't think people should be upset. This was a great race. I saw in Jeff Gluck's poll in the last 4.5 years, highest rated plate race that we've seen, 3rd highest polled NASCAR race in the last 5 years. It was really exciting. That was what prime Talladega looks like, and I really hope they stick with this plate package. And I want to just say, we were concerned about the lower horsepower. One more quick thing, the lower horsepower really didn't seem to affect the racing. We still saw cars over 200 miles an hour. It kept the cars on the ground, so we didn't see an incident like Ryan Newman had. We still had great racing. And like we predicted last week, 2 and 3 wide racing, and we saw even some of the underfunded teams not necessarily get all the way to the front. But I saw Brennan Poole, Gray Galding, both driving in Rick Ware-affiliated premium motorsports cars, hanging around in the lead draft for a decent amount of time as well and competing up there.
Well, what I was going to say is what was so great about this Talladega race as well in particular, I haven't had a Talladega race in a long time, Eddie, where I'm saying for 60 laps, oh my goodness, they're going to wreck, and they just never do. I think about all the old times back in the Generation 5 races for NASCAR where everyone was coming to the start-finish line trying to find their way around the leader. It did for Talladega race, if you noticed, the cars that were always up in front, Eddie, were the best all-around cars. Tyler Reddick, Joey Logano, obviously Ryan Blaney, who went on the win. Eric Jones, for the most part, was in the top 10 all day long. Alex Bowman, he went up to the lead a couple times. You had Bubba Wallace up there as well. And so many others, but it was the same people all day long. But what made it fun, by the way, Ricky Stenhouse as well, but they were up there all day long. And what made it fun was because they weren't scared to make it 2-3 wide. Now, sure, maybe the race being canceled Sunday could have had a little bit more to do with that as well. But, this race was incredible. These guys were, sure, they're not touching 200, but it felt like for 60, 80 laps plus, they were going to wreck, and they just simply didn't. But I do want to ask this to you, Eddie, as well. Obviously, you mentioned the Ryan Blaney incident towards the end. I feel that this style of racing, if NASCAR keeps it, can only get better from here. It was awesome. The fans loved it. But I ask this, do you think if NASCAR institutes a 1-block rule, especially on the final lap, will there be less wrecked race cars coming to the checkered flag of a race? And will it promote 4 wide or 5 wide finishes?
I like the idea, but I'm not really sure about that, because if it's just the 1-block rule, can you imagine how forceful that 1 block might be? We know how aggressive. Just think about the last 3 plate races where Ryan Blaney's been up front at the very end, and he's not a dirty driver. I'm not calling Ryan Blaney a dirty driver. He's a very talented person, but he gets very aggressive at the end. We saw him bumping and banging with Newman at Talladega. Of course, the finish to the 500, which certainly wasn't his fault, but he was being aggressive with Newman there, and Newman was trying to block, and he did pull 2 blocks. I will say that. He went one way and then he went the other. But I like the idea, but I think restricting these drivers, and the one other thing is I don't think NASCAR would want to be in a situation where they're counting the number of blocks someone does and have to take away a win from somebody, because I feel like there would be a lot of uproar, specifically depending on who the person was. If there was like a Chase Elliott, a Ryan Blaney, that did a two block thing, and then they ended up taking away the victory from them for doing that. I feel like I agree with you. That could help with getting 3-4 wide finishes, but I don't know. I like the idea. I like the thought process, but I don't think logistically this would work. But I still think, like you said, this package can really grow from here. And I think Talladega was set a really good precedent. And I'm excited what's going to happen with this at Daytona in September.
Well, the only reason why I mention it, Eddie, is because we saw down the front stretch in particular, and obviously, a lot of people not big fans of what Ryan Blaney did. Now, I understand it. First off, you're protecting the win, but with today's aspect of NASCAR in the sport, side draft is such a critical factor, and the only way you can stall out a run of a car is if you unfortunately door them, especially going up the track. And that's what Blaney had to do. Obviously, Blaney had the nose, but he was trying to kill the momentum and stay out in front. But at the same time, going down that front straightaway, or I should say rather the tri-oval, he didn't throw just one block. He threw 3 different blocks to protect the lead. And you go back and you think about situations as well many years ago. You remember when Michael Waltrip was battling for the lead in that Talladega race that gave Dale Jr. a concussion and sent Tony Stewart up and over? I think about that race because this is what Talladega also has become in super speedways. The vicious block is still a factor even with you reducing the horsepower. If you make and allow one move to be done, I think that, it's, hey, all right, you think the driver's going to go high, throw the block. If it's not there, unfortunately lose the race, but there could be a guy that's in 7th place that could come out of nowhere and win the race. So, I just seem to think that it could be beneficial for not just more exciting finishes, but also it creates the drivers having a situation in which they have to decide they have to have the skill of when's the right time to put the block on and what lane to be in. And I think it will show more skill in a super speedway race as well.
I like the idea. I mean, I don't know how logistically it would completely work out. And we know how NASCAR has had issues with various rules in the past at super speedways. Think about in non-cup races, you're not allowed to lock bumpers with someone else, and we've seen really good drivers penalized for that in the past. Also, let's not forget that yellow line rule with Regan Smith and Tony Stewart that finished almost 12 years ago that still gets talked about now. And you can tell Regan Smith is still kind of frustrated about how that ended up. But I like the idea overall that you've given, but I think we can just wrap it up with this. It was a wild weekend for NASCAR, of course. Fortunately, that did not turn out to be a actual noose that was there from what it all appears, or a hate crime against Bubba Wallace. But we saw a nice show of solidarity from all the drivers, and we saw one of the best Talladega races we've seen in recent memory. And at this point, I'm going to move on to topic 3 of 4 today, and we're going to get into this MLB restart. Tim, finally, there's been a deal reached. There's been a mandated 60-game season by Rob Manfred, be kicking off on July 23rd. Major League's universal DH throughout. We're going to see 60 games, 40 against your divisional opponent, 20 against your geographic counterpart in the other leagues. So the AL East and NL East will square off. And some specific rules regarding coronavirus. There was a special COVID injured list that you're going to have to pass the test negatively twice to be brought back onto your team after you've tested positive. There's also other rules regarding spitting, high-fiving, chewing tobacco, sunflower seeds. I mean, some of those things are gonna be difficult to enforce, but I think major leagues are prepared, and I think a 60-game season is the perfect length for this. There's gonna be very little travel, depending on how it all suits up, but still, you're just gonna be playing teams local for the most part. And we're going to see some fun matchups, too. I'm excited to see Dodgers-Astros, especially after everything that went down with them. We're going to see some Mets-Yankees. A lot of fun matchups in the East as well. In the Central, I'm excited to see the Twins, such a solid squad, taking on the Cubs and the Brewers and everybody in the NL Central. I think it's going to be really exciting. The one other thing I do want to note that I'm kind of happy about, they did not expand the playoffs. Remember how Dr. Fauci had talked about how he really wants things wrapped up early on in October with the threat of a potential second wave of coronavirus. And if we're starting July 23rd, season would end around, I think, September 26th. And the playoffs would probably go, mid to late October. I mean, they go a couple weeks past, but in expanded playoffs, you don't want November baseball given the circumstances right now, especially with the chance of a real second wave of coronavirus kicking in. Obviously, if cases really go up, we might see some changes with this. But for now, we've got everything all set. July 23rd, opening day for baseball, and I'm really excited to see it come back. And I think the way it's set up right now is the best possible way they can do it at this point.
What now? I have to ask Eddie, was the only difference from their last proposal to this proposal was the fact that there was no extended postseason? Because to me, just based upon what I've read, I'm like, what's the difference from what they last denied? And they could have really gotten this done a couple days ago. But, I am so happy Major League Baseball is coming back. I cannot wait for spring training to get back. But I am also eager to say this as well. Will Major League Baseball allow players that don't feel comfortable during COVID? They haven't really announced this yet. That's why to not play, because we're seeing it right now in the NBA, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We're very likely, to my understanding, going to see in the NFL when that season comes around. And we're also seeing the NHL as well. So I'm eager to see, will baseball also hold that to the same standard and respect players that don't want to come back at this time?
I really think there's a lot of room that they can do that because we know so many of the superstars just tell us when and where. It's not like they're going to be losing so many big caliber players if they allow that. I mean, I think there would be certain people, depending on their family situations, if they know anybody else who's had COVID or has died from it. I mean, I really think it's important to give the players the option because you never know. I mean, it's a tough situation and it's a tough decision for any player. And the one thing that I am wondering is just how this is going to all work with travel, because at least for now, obviously things could change if we see more spikes in other states. But for now, there's not going to be any sort of bubble like we're seeing in the NBA or about the 2 neutral sites that we'll likely see in hockey. I mean, that there's going to be so much. It's not going to be that much travel, but there's still, I'm thinking about the Mets and Yankees. They're each going to have to play Tampa Bay and Miami. So those are 4 trips total from Florida to New York City. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all settles, but I think it's important to give players the option at least. And we're seeing it in the NBA, and it's not like there's that many players that are pulling out. We've seen a couple. We've seen Avery Bradley and a couple of others, but I really think that in terms of integrity, that would be the best thing for baseball to do.
Indeed, in terms of baseball coming back as well, I'm very eager to see how the main market teams are going to approach this situation, particularly the Mets, Yankees, and the Dodgers, because COVID numbers are still drastically increasing, believe it or not, in the state of New York as well as Los Angeles. So I'm very eager to see how, they approach this situation, because I would imagine in terms of the schedule, they're probably going to stack the home games, in bunches and then utilize an off day to allow these teams to travel on the road, because I believe they do get 10 off days, if I'm not mistaken, in this span. But, I'm really excited. Universal DH. I think this as well is going to make or break how it'll go going into next season. We mentioned last podcast or a few podcasts ago, Eddie, that we were real excited to see the universal DH and that we're excited to see it carry on and maybe, end in the National League side. But this is now a key factor, because now we're going to start seeing teams have to start, maybe signing extra players, especially on the NL side, that they may have not had interest in signing before, simply because they bring a good bat. So you're going to see, and you mentioned, I believe as well, Yoenis Cespedes in the past. Suddenly, he has a bigger role, because while he may not be able to play in the field as well due to his health concerns, he can swing the bat. So, NL teams have a big plus here, especially with a couple of baseball players as well that are pretty solid out there in the free agency that still haven't signed with teams due to this pandemic.
And, 2 things. First off, with the Mets, I was reading an article from Anthony DiComo, their beat reporter, and that how this situation really, for example, and I think there's other teams that are in the same spot, but specifically for the Mets, this is a really good situation, because now you can find a way to get Yoenis Cespedes' bat in the lineup. When he needs a day off, they also still have Dominic Smith, who is not really that great when it comes to play in the field, but he's also a very solid hitter and a good choice to have. On the other end, I do want to mention, like you said, free agents. Yasiel Puig still hasn't been signed yet. He's a really good player, really good hitter, and a nice defensive outfielder that, teams specifically in the National League, when they've got this presence of the DH and need one more offensive starter every day, he's the type of guy that I could see a team try to bring in. There's a lot of other really talented free agents out there, and I think this is going to be very interesting over the next couple of weeks. But I got to ask you, Tim, just quickly, what team do you think in a 60-game season rather than a full 162 has like the most outstanding advantage compared to whether it had been a full season with it just being 60 games?
Well, that's a good question because I talked about it on Bop Ball yesterday, Eddie, and we mentioned this as well a few podcasts ago, where it's no longer, like you mentioned, 162, you have the capability to slump early on. Now you don't. And to be honest, I'm looking directly in the AL Central. There is a team in particular that I think is a huge advantage in this scenario that's always known for starting off hot and falling off, and that's the Chicago White Sox. I think the White Sox are going to be a team to look for in the AL Central. Obviously, we know the Twins are the premier team right now in that Central Division, but you can't count out the Indians either. So I think the White Sox, they're going to be a team to look for. Obviously, everyone's going to say the Yankees, the Dodgers are going to be, favorites as well, even the Cubs. But I really think the White Sox may be a team to look for because, I remember about 2 years ago, they were the first team to win 20 games, 30 games, and then they kind of fell off a cliff. But that doesn't matter. If you come out and you win 30 games or the first team to win 30 games in a 60-game season, that's automatically, you're very likely going to not just win your division, but go to the playoffs. And I also think you're going to see divisions as well more crowded together. The Red Sox, for example, they may be in a quote-unquote rebuilding phase after trading away Mookie Betts, but they also tend to get off to very good starts. The Yankees, in fact, are a very slow start team based upon history. So the Yankees could be competing for a wild card compared to the Rays or the Red Sox that, may play well through the first 40 games and could be in the division lead. So I don't think those very good teams, unless they play in a very weak division, will end up prevailing right away.
Yeah, and the other thing is just the importance. I talked about this last week of each and every game. You're not really going to see as much for these teams, if it's a long extra inning game, they just, pack their bags and whatever happens the next day happens. Every game is going to be so important with such a shortened schedule. And the other thing that I want to talk about, we won't see as many really long extra inning games with the runner on second in the 10th inning. It's going to be interesting to see how that works. The one thing I did see them clarify yesterday that Jeff Passan reported is that it will be an unearned run against the pitcher if that person from second base comes in to score in extra innings, which I think would be very good because I think that really it's unfair to the pitcher specifically because he did not put that runner on base. He allowed him to score, but I think that's a very nice call from baseball.
Yeah, that's tournament rules right there. And I'm very intrigued that baseball added that because, to be honest, I was fine with universal DH. I'm not really a big fan of that, to be honest. I understand trying to shorten games as much as you can and, starting with a runner on second. But at the same time, what is there to win from that? You're taking away from the game of baseball and how it's traditionally played. Why? Because we went past a full game in distance. Just let the winners be decided. While, yes, this is going to create strategy, you're going to see, especially NL teams that specialize in this. Sure, they can't bat the pitcher now, but they'll be more than glad to bunt a runner over the third base in extra innings. So, there's an advantage in that side. But I'm not a big fan of it, to be honest. I really just think let the game be played. It's that simple. Let the game go naturally. If we see a 20-inning game, so be it. Because, quite frankly, sure, 20-inning games go on and on and on. But by the end of the night, the whole world's watching that game. So, people want to see it. I don't really think that was necessary.
Yeah, and one last thing on baseball connecting to that. I mean, it's really weird how they've handled it. You know, the big calls for pace of play ever since Bryce Harper with his Make Baseball Fun Again or whatever hats and all that a few years ago. But I feel like Major League Baseball, specifically Rob Manfred, have been really careful to not lose, the mainstream baseball audience in pace of play. Because, think about the cycle, not this year, but in the past, every February, oh, we're going to be so strict with the pitch clock and the first week of spring training that matters. And then when I go to a baseball game in May and I look over at this clock hitting 0 at Citi Field and nothing ever happens, and they're not actually doing anything to affect the 9 innings, I feel like if they want to make a change with pace of play, address the game that you know is going to happen, because just adding this runner on second in extra innings makes it a little gimmicky, and you're not addressing it because, frankly, a game that's got extra innings is already a long game anyway. Try to address the games that are more common in the first place. I'm not saying starting to add runners on second base during the game, but I feel like if they were more strict with the pitch clock and other rule changes, those could be beneficial. But I want to get into the last topic now, and that is NBA, because we've seen a lot of news this week. Coronavirus testing has started. We've seen a couple players test positive. Nikola Jokic of the Nuggets is one. Jabari Parker is another. We've seen a few, actually. And we've seen a couple of signings. We've seen Tyler Johnson sign with the Nets. Avery Bradley was one of the first to say he has opted out of going to Orlando for this restart of the season. We've seen Davis Bertans of the Wizards also. We don't really know the whole situation with Victor Oladipo, but we know he's had a lot of injuries. That's still up in the air. But I think it's very interesting because we see a lot of really talented free agents out there. We've seen J.R. Smith, Nick Young, a couple of veteran guys that really want to get playing. And J.R. Smith, if he ends up on the Lakers playing with LeBron James, I don't even know what's going to happen with that. But, I mean, it's really fun, and I'm really excited to see what's going to happen. And it's going to be interesting to see how this works out with the coronavirus testing and then getting started with playing.
I'm sorry, I just had to laugh when you said J.R. Smith, because I still, as a Cleveland Cavaliers fan, I suffer every day when I go back and watch highlights of J.R. Smith forgetting the score and ultimately being the reason why the Cavaliers lost in the NBA Finals, even though they were down in a deficit, don't get me wrong. But that really switched the momentum and cost the Cavaliers that series. But, to have him go and unite with LeBron, hopefully LeBron knocks some sense into him and hopefully remembers the score. But, the way I look at this is that I'm glad there are some players opting out. I think that it's huge for teams right now that aren't having players come back to turn around and get key free agents. And you mentioned there are good key free agents. And by the way, one thing you did mention, or I don't think you mentioned, Vince Carter just announced his retirement. I think that's something that's also really huge because you're starting to see some veteran players walk away. And gosh, I mean, now we're really talking a brand new basketball era, because an NBA without Vince Carter, and everyone thinks about his vintage years, especially with all his dunks. Well, now he's walked away and he's called it quits for a career. The NBA's changing, and it's changing on a quickly basis, and it's scary to think we're not going to have too many years left of LeBron James. Obviously, we know Kobe Bryant unfortunately passed away in a tragic accident, but he retired, a few years back. All of a sudden now, and the NBA needs a new face, and for the moment right now, it seems to be Giannis. But at the same time, we don't really know. It's a youth movement right now in the NBA, which I find it to be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many talented young players. Think about Trae Young, Luka Doncic. Of course, you mentioned Giannis. The two hotshot rookies, Zion and Ja Morant, who have really taken the NBA by storm this year. We're going to see both of them in the restart. All of those players will be in the restart. The one other thing that I think is going to be interesting to see is one of the rules in the long list of NBA protocols for this restart, which even goes as deep as saying that you can only play one-on-one ping pong instead of two-on-two, because you'd be violating social distancing then. The most interesting one is that the players can go and attend the other games. So it's like, for example, you could have like a Clippers, just say a Clippers Rockets game, and you've got LeBron James and Chris Paul heckling as the only two fans in the stands. I mean, I don't really know what to make of all this.
Are they going to allow Bill Belichick at this point in Orlando? Because I mean, he would love to get some videotape, even though he doesn't coach basketball. But yeah, I mean that's a situation I'm telling you right now that's going to pop up. Eddie, I just have that feeling. Teams are going to take the extent they, they could put cameras on the players' heads, for example, and try to get exclusive footage to scout these players out. But I think it's a terrible idea. Don't get me wrong. You're trying to, yes, create social distancing. I understand saying, yeah, yes, the players can come and spectate the games. But the point of going to Orlando was to keep a safe distance and keep everyone safe. There was the point of not having fans in attendance. I know the NBA players aren't technically fans, but why? There's no point in this. Just practice social distancing, keep them safe, and just let them play the sport of basketball. That's the point of you going to Orlando. At this point, if that's what you wanted, everyone should have stayed home. Everyone should have continued their seasons. There would have been no point of you going to Orlando. So if you're going to Orlando, there's no point of having these players out there and being in even more risk, especially when they're not on the court. So, I'm not a big fan of that either. I really think the NBA is making a critical mistake, especially as well with Orlando opening up to people coming in along with Disney. I just think it's an accident really waiting to happen.
Yeah, and one thing I do want to mention on that, though, that I actually saw on the news today is that there has been a petition of as many as 7,000 Disney World employees who have been calling for them to keep the park closed. It's scheduled to open July 15th, about a week and a half after NBA camps open. So it'll be interesting to see. Right now, the only thing open in Disney World is the shopping area, Disney Springs, which would be very far away from where all the NBA action would be happening. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all works out in the next couple of weeks. But just to wrap things up today, I mean, we've seen some positivity coming up. I mean, looks like baseball is going to be starting soon. We know July is going to be fun, especially the end of July, depending on when hockey starts as well. We know the MLS tournament is starting soon. Women's Soccer League starting in the next few days. We saw English Premier League come back. Golf is in action. I mean, it's starting to come back, and a lot of these sports are being very careful with the safety measures. I know certain cases might not be the best. We were just talking about the NBA allowing players as spectators of other games, but it's going to be interesting to see how this progresses. So on Monday, we'll be back to recap the weekend in sports and talk about what is to come. But until then, I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
And we'll see you next time. This is Sports Speak.